Africa, ICLE Local Governments for Sustainability, and presenting today on some work we've been doing around urban ecosystem-based adaptation. So, who is ICLE? Some of you are familiar with us, some of you aren't. It's an international network of cities and local governments, and we're a not-for-profit organization with regional offices around the world. And what we really try to do is to connect leaders from cities and local governments, accelerate their action on sustainability, and try and provide them with solutions, but actually mostly try and get them to share the solutions that they're implementing at the local level. So it's very much almost like a very giant community of practice. And so we have a number of offices around the world, and I'm situated in the Africa office in Cape Town. And within that office, we also have our Global Center for Biodiversity, which is the ICLE Cities Biodiversity Center. And within Africa, we have members, so we're also a membership organization, and we have currently around 70 or so members throughout Africa, and quite a strong presence in South Africa, obviously because we're here and it's close by, and we want to work with the people around us as well. So why focus on cities and local governments? Well, ICLE's real prime interests and areas, as I said, are cities and local governments, and it's because the world is rapidly urbanizing. I think we all realize that. There's also processes of decentralization happening, and at the same time, massive degradation and loss of ecosystem services. And cities also are where our consumption happens, so we can have a lot of positive impact at a city level as well, through communications, education, and public awareness as well. And yes, so globally we're 50% urbanized already, and the trajectories for that are rapidly increasing. And of course we rely on biological resources for a lot of what we do. And many cities are in biodiversity hotspots, which is also a potential positive aspect that we can work with. I like this figure because it's a bit of a in your face, a bit of a shocker, and hopefully wake you all up, is that more than 60% of the area projected to be urban in 2030 has yet to be built. And we're talking about a 15-year time span. And that's staggering, and if any of you want to read the city's biodiversity outlook, it was just released in the last few months. It's really interesting, and they also have a big science background paper to that as well. I think the website is Cities Biodiversity Outlook, but I can give you those links. So we're faced with a major challenge, but at the same time there's huge opportunity. How can we make sure that in these next very short years we try and do things differently? And how do we ensure that, for this presentation, what I'm focusing on is that nature and ecosystems are included in what we're doing. And of course, on top of this development trajectory are also the impacts of climate change. And this is another really excellent read that I would recommend to any of you interested in cities and urbanization. Is a publication called Future-Proofing Cities, put out by Difford and Atkins International. And they call it the perfect storm of risks that are facing cities. So there's a lot going on. And we know that there's water, energy, food security, transport, health. All of these are being impacted not only by current challenges, but also by climate change. And there's one of the examples they put up here is the cost per year of replacing the ecosystem services provided by Durbin's network of green open spaces is 38% of the city's total budget. I mean, cities can't afford to be having to deal with these kinds of challenges, but they're going to in the future, and it's going to impact our economies. I think we all are on the same page. We know that the climate's changing, communities must change with the times. So it's a little bit scary, there's a lot going on, but there are a lot of solutions. And how do we decide what solutions to put in place, where, how? There's a massive basket of solutions that local governments are having to face and figure out and muddle their way through what to do. So focusing in on urban biodiversity, ICLE has been working in this field of work for a very long time with its cities that have been pioneering through the Local Action for Biodiversity program. And in fact, a couple of South African cities were the ones that essentially invented the program. So it came from South Africa, which is quite cool, I think. But it's a program that's worked globally with about 50 cities now. And from that, our interest grew around ecosystem-based approaches to climate change. So in terms of urban biodiversity, why focus on it? You know, we often have this perception that biodiversity is kind of out there. It's in game reserves, it's in the ocean, but it's not in our urban environments where most of us live. Urban areas often contain restored or remnant ecosystems, but they're essential for ecosystem services, and cities are starting to realize this more and more and realizing the mistakes of the past. And that it's both within the city boundaries, of course, and also in the mountain catchments outside of their boundaries, which also makes it difficult to try and manage the ecosystem services that are required in an urban area. And there's another initiative called the Urban Biosphere Initiative, which looks at that city-regional linkage, which is quite an interesting space, which will be, I think, gaining a lot more momentum in the next couple of years, with a lot of partners basically working on that. So many ecosystem services, but critically in terms of climate change, adapting, being more resilient. A new word I heard the other day called transilience, which is transforming to resilience. All sorts of new words coming out. So when and where is ecosystem-based adaptation appropriate in urban areas, and how do we decide? This is a really new field of work. So some departure points for our work was that the role of EBA is recognized, it's starting to be recognized as part of urban adaptation and disaster risk reduction, but not very well defined. There are some pioneers out there, there are some early adopters of this, but it's also different regions are different and every local context is completely different. So climate change adaptation is relatively new in many of the African local governments we're working with in other countries. And they're saying that they need direction around assessing impacts, how do they monitor and evaluate what they're starting to do, and particularly for ecosystem-based adaptation. So, I mean, there are cities out there that are doing fantastic work, the Rotterdams of the world and so on, but their contexts are very different. Their cities look very different to our cities in Africa. So, the title of this project and work is around ecosystem-based approaches to building resilience in urban areas, making the case for a framework for smart decision-making criteria. Sounds very complex. I don't like words like framework and criteria. But anyway, that's what we set out to do. We really wanted to figure out when is EBA appropriate in urban areas and how can you discuss this? How, in an African context, do we link strongly to poverty alleviation and informality? You know, what our cities look like. We're dealing with cities like Dar es Salaam, where 70% of their population live in informal areas. And that's a population of around 5 million. So very different to places like Rotterdam, where they're doing excellent work. How do we decide and make decisions about a suite of adaptation measures? Decision makers are faced with often being given a plethora of different ideas, different ways of approaching things, and ecosystem-based approaches are one of those, or can be used in combination with others. And how do we know if what we're doing is being effective? So we wanted to also link to something which I'll mention a bit more about later, is the Durbin Adaptation Charter for local governments, and link to some work, future work that wants to be done around monitoring and evaluation at the local government level. But really, what will help decision makers? What will make their lives easier and help them be more informed about these tough decisions? So just a quick insert about the Durbin Adaptation Charter for local governments. This came out of COP17 in Durbin through the local government side events that happened there, where over 1,000 local governments signed up to commit to say, hey, we're going to take action and start helping to adapt our cities, our local governments, and our communities. So there's 10 principles in there, and one of them is on ecosystem-based adaptation and municipal green infrastructure. So the nice thing about that is you have some political commitment and some traction, but it's now how do you help provide guidance, evidence, etc., and bring all the partners to the table that can help the local governments on this particular point. So we were funded by the Climate and Development Knowledge Network through the Innovation Fund 2. Yeah. And fantastic because they're funding work that is quite different. It's different to your normal funding streams. eThekwini was the lead city. And what we did was we had selected 5 cities from around Africa, one of them being Durbin. We did case studies and structured interviews around potentially what they might be doing, which might be seen as ecosystem-based adaptation. We wrote this up into a research and case study document, which you all can get access to and read. It's very interesting. And also looked at the current status of urban EBA. What is happening out there? What are people doing? What do we know? And what we went through really was a backcasting exercise with these cities to try and explore a very complicated, interesting, and messy area of work. We heard a bit about backcasting earlier today. So, I mean, there's so much I could share with you, and I have 1 minute. So I just wanted to really focus on the backcasting side of it, because I thought this was really fun and innovative. And it was, for me, actually, I learned a lot from it as well, because it was a really scary process. When we started it, I thought it was going to be a complete disaster, but it wasn't. It actually turned out really well. So backcasting is used in complex situations, and it's a process, a way of starting social learning. And we're figuring out more and more is that social learning is really critical in terms of dealing with climate change and complex challenges. So we had the city groups. Each city had a group of people that came, completely different types of people: city planners, water engineers, biodiversity people. They almost had like a little sort of multi-sectoral team for each city. What we did was start with a culture of sharing and inspiration, start with a positive. What are people doing out there, and not starting with the negative of climate change, you know. Then try and get them to look at planning the future of a resilient urban system. So they went through the backcasting process within each of their city and thought about their own local context and what they were dealing with and what they wanted to get to in the future. So actually then more reflection going through the process of backcasting. They looked at action plans and learning processes within their city and came up with principles and guiding questions, which were all completely different for every city because they were all focusing on slightly different aspects related to ecosystem-based adaptation. So in the end, we really wanted to come out with actually smart indicators and this framework, but I think we were highly, highly overambitious, which you kind of have to be these days in terms of dealing with climate change. So we've got principles and guiding questions. We've got the start of a framework, and what we really want to do next is move on and try and practice, do more of this with these cities and go into more depth with them. So we're seeking funding if anyone has some out there. That would be great. So really what we got to was around the framework was guiding questions and principles and criteria for assessing relevance and effectiveness. I think those are two key terms that came out throughout the process. A few reflections, I'm almost done. We had to raise our level of ambition. It's a difficult topic, and we may not have come out with exactly what we wanted out of the workshop process, but I think that we're on the right track. There was a diversity of stakeholders, which is critical. We keep hearing that over and over and over and over again, and it is critical, and it's great when you have that. One of the things we discussed a lot was that you almost need disruptive processes and serious transformation in terms of ecosystem-based adaptation, but anything around climate change, really. And we talk a lot about radical change within our organization, and these are the kinds of things that are needed. There were completely different indicators for each local government. So, you know, what is actually useful to provide as a framework across a plethora of completely different contexts, and that's something that we often have to think about. But hopefully we can get there and provide something useful. Performance management of EBA is challenging. I think even just dealing with biodiversity is challenging. The uncertainty of the capacity of ecosystems to deliver what we think it's going to do It's not always going to solve our problems. A lot of us that are kind of from the biodiversity background think it is going to be the problem solver, but not necessarily. And cost-benefit analysis is extremely challenging. We heard some examples earlier. So I think I'll end off with this point, and you can read the other reflections from the audience, but from the members who joined the workshop. But in conclusion is that there are many challenges around urban ecosystem-based adaptation, but it can potentially provide some low or no regret interventions, obviously depending on what you're looking at. And there are a host of co-benefits, and the co-benefits are really difficult to try and value. And the thing is that a lot of local governments are really seeking these low or no regret solutions because of the uncertainty of the climate change projections at the local level. And we heard that yesterday, someone questioning, well, what do you do? And that uncertainty is a real factor, so low and no regret options. Anyway, okay, thank you very much. You can ask me all questions at lunchtime.
Thanks, Sarah.